Welcome. Today we're doing a pretty big talk for a lot of people, camellias. There's a lot of talk surrounding camellias, a lot of popularity, even some disdain for camellias. And so we're going to kind of talk a little bit about camellias, the positives, the negatives, and why you can really use it in any garden in our area with the proper use. So yeah, we should have everyone's microphone muted. We'll take questions at the end. So if there's any questions, and if we can't handle that question right now, we can definitely find someone who can research that. I just kind of did a little shout out here to Honora McGarry. She took a real pretty picture of our new baby Elijah. He's a little over a month old right now. So I had to do a little plug for our cute baby boy that we just brought. And now that he's old enough, we'll be doing a lot more of these webinars. So thanks again for that beautiful photo, and we'll get going on camellias. Okay, so camellia. Some people call it winter rose. You don't hear that as much. And we're also going to talk at the end about a couple other unique cultivars that you don't see as much in cultivation, but if you're a collector, you can get, and one of those is Stewartia, also known as a camellia tree. So we're going to talk about selection care, a little bit of history of camellias. So let's go ahead and dive in. So camellias, what's the big deal? Most people have heard of camellias. They may not know much about them. They are prized, and they've been prized for thousands of years for their big glossy leaves. Showy blooms, which tend to happen in the winter months, all the way from October through April, depending on the variety. And this is something that's going to light up the garden when nothing else is going on. So that's really a great benefit. And then once they're established, and if they're put in the right spot, they can really be very easy to take care of. So those are the reasons it's a pretty popular plant. Collectors and enthusiasts really like this plant. It's one of the most captive bred plants, meaning there's hundreds of varieties, tons of selections if you're a collector. Easy to find a lot of these, easy to grow. You can go to the American Camellia Society website. You can even be a member if you want to go tour their gardens. They actively catalog all the new name varieties every year. There's currently, and this is of Michael A. Durr's book, probably 10 years old, 30,000 plus different named varieties of camellia. So, and I'm sure there's hundreds more at this point. So just a vast number. And then lastly, tea culture. This is something that's kind of grown in popularity over the few past decades. Most of our teas, green teas, come from Camellia Sinensis. And this is the oldest historical record we have of camellia. You can, in this area, pretty safely harvest your own tea leaves and enjoy fragrant blooms, one of the few fragrant varieties of camellia that honeybees just flock to. So it can be really good for a utilitarian garden. Okay, so just a little bit history, modern use. You know, if you're not a big history person, you could tune out for this part. But camellias go back for a really long time. Most of them are thought to come from the Orient, so China, Japan, that area of the world. In Japan, they're called tsubaki. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, or tree with shining leaves. The Sinensis variety is used mostly in the area of China and that area of Asia since 1700 BC. And it's thought to have been brought to London about 50 years later through the tea trade. And after all of that tea trade, cultivation started taking off for gardens and for blooms and varieties, and then eventually making its way to the United States, early 20th century, I think usually like 1920s, 1930s. There's a little plaque there you can see. First public camellia show in the United States was in 1932 near Macon, Georgia. A lot of camellias get bred in Georgia. That's where the American Camellia Society is located. And so today, camellias are definitely still actively cultivated. About 250 different species are reported. Typically, we're only seeing about 3 or 4 of those species common in garden centers. So there's a lot out there. Over 30,000 cultivars, which is just a massive number. Over 30,000 cultivars have been introduced through the American Camellia Society. And looking at their website, this year alone in 2020, 56 cultivars have been created and named. So it's super active. They're a great resource. You can go to the American Camellia Society website, and I'll put a link at the end here. They have a garden in Georgia, in Fort Valley. You can go tour that garden. Great resource for camellias. As well as tea. Tea is becoming bigger in the United States, and there are tea plantations now coming up. So the big one I know about is in Fairhope, Alabama. I think they claim to have over 40,000 plants, and they sell their own tea. You can tour their facilities. So something that's actively growing in the United States. So I like to do rule of thumbs. Our first rule of thumb is when you're planting camellia, do it in a protected location. So part sun, part shade, typically close to a wall or a structure to protect it from winter wind is ideal. So using camellia, 3 main areas I think you could use camellia in the garden, and I'm going to touch on those. Of course, there's probably more that you can think of, but these are the 3 that kind of stand out to me. So foundation planting, typically we're talking up against walls, under windows, a great place for camellia. They can be pruned under windows, and they can be maintained without winter winds on non-east facing walls. The big thing to avoid is an east facing wall that gets really hot. This could cause some damage in the summer to your camellia. They can be used under windows and on corners. There's a little picture here in the middle of the slide that kind of shows a camellia on a corner, kind of as a turning point coming up to the front porch of a house. It's really nice to be able to walk around these plants, enjoy the blooms, enjoy the foliage, put them somewhere where people will engage them, is really nice. As an accent plant, so we're talking centerpiece, focal point, something in the middle of a bed to kind of set that area off. These should still be protected beds. So near a tree, under a tree, or near a wall with plantings around it, still protect it. Try to avoid in an open field or by a mailbox. And you'll get year-round interest out of these. So large size, evergreen leaves, and again, those blooms, which are going to happen when typically nothing else is blooming. And then lastly, in a pot, I don't necessarily recommend this a lot, but you can definitely grow camellia in a pot. You just need to be cautious of cold temps in pots, especially if they're thinner, if they're in an exposed location. And then also over/under watering, which tends to be more pronounced when a plant's in a pot. So keep your camellias in a pot on a porch or somewhere where you can bring them inside once we get to freezing weather. Into a garage with windows would be fine over the winter. And then just be able to keep an eye on that water, not let it go too dry or stay too wet. Couple pictures I put on here. There's a camellia in the top right. That's kind of a good example of a camellia that's starting to turn into a tree. It's probably Camellia japonica. That one may be Yuletide, but just giving you an example of how big these plants can get. And then on the bottom right, just kind of showing an example of what can happen if these camellias are exposed, especially during their bloom cycle. You can definitely get frostbite on these blooms because they tend to bloom around the same time we're getting a late frost. So In the bottom right, there's a bloom with frost burn. If it sits too far exposed in cold weather and too much excessive growth, you can definitely lose your blooms. So protected areas are kind of the big key here. Planting and care, definitely an important part of all successful gardens. Planting tips, we've already done a couple of videos on planting, and we're going to kind of go with that exact same recommendation. So when planting, plant close to a structure, specifically without standing water. So if you have gutters or drainways going into this bed, watch out. Dig the hole twice the size of the pot. Amend the soil to lighten and improve drainage. We make our own landscape soil conditioner, Earth Mix Landscape. And I meant to put, sorry, it's not on the slide here, or our pine fines. If you have really heavy soil, you could put our pine fines into condition up to 50%. So camellias like good drainage, definitely condition that soil. Plant with the surface roots at or above soil level, meaning don't bury the root system of this plant under mulch or under soil. And then when you amend the soil, use that to plant in. So backfill with some of your native soil and the amendment. And then initially water the shrub heavily. So when you plant, give that plant a good soaking. I mean, we're talking, 30 minutes of good soaking. And then you should be able to take a break for, maybe a week or so. Care and upkeep. As you're going on with your camellia, continue to water. Basically only water if it starts to dry out. When you water heavily. So really soak that plant, allow it to dry out. Obviously, this means more water in the summer when it's dry, much less in the winter. When we're pruning, really, I only recommend pruning if you really need to shape it and just after they're blooming. So whether they bloom in the fall or in the spring, immediately after those blooms fall off is a good time to start pruning. Fertilizer. I wouldn't do any heavy nitrogen fertilizer on camellia just to avoid excessive tender new growth. Hollytone's a great product. It's not going to really push this plant to grow a lot, and it's going to really help with the evergreen characteristics and what this plant really prefers in soil. Check periodically for insect and disease issues. We're not going to go real deep into the insect and disease issues, but there are a couple on camellia. The ones you should really look out for is leaf spot and root rot, which tends to be the same pathogen. So that's usually excessive moisture on the leaves or moisture in the soil. So just allowing this plant to be in a well-drained, not excessively watered spot. And then the insect scale is kind of a big one on camellia, as it is a lot of other evergreen plants. So scale is one of those things you're going to see on the underside of the leaf typically, or on the stem. If you think you have a scale issue, take a picture, bring it into us, and we'll see if we can diagnose it. You can definitely treat for that. All right, second rule of thumb. When you're pruning, less than 30% is a great rule of thumb, and then just after flowering. So that's usually going to be winter for fall flowering camellias and spring for end of winter, early spring flowering camellias. All right, pruning. Usually what I get the most questions about is pruning. As we said before, avoid cutting back too much. So 30% is a good rule of thumb. Generally no cuts above like thumb size. That can cause a lot of damage to the plant. Really watch out for cutting back before spring frost. So if you're going to cut them in the spring, wait till after the frost so we don't get damaged tissue. Sharpen your pruners. Try to use sharp, clean tools. If there is any disease in these plants, or if you're pruning a diseased plant, we don't want that to transfer to a camellia, especially because they can be a little slower growing. We don't want to set them back by introducing a disease. So clean your pruners, alcohol or Lysol or something like that. Prune just above the buds or nodes, and we can look at that specifically on a plant. the picture down at the bottom right shows a lot of new growth. I would probably start pruning that plant down just above a leaf, which is a bud or a node on these plants, to get the cleanest look and the most response out of that cut. Just general pruning for different shapes and sizes. Let the plant grow to desired size, so wherever you want it to go, and then every year start cutting that amount back. So if it gets to 4 foot where you want it, it may grow up to 5 foot that year. Just know you need to cut about a foot off every year when you prune to keep it to that shape. You can also trim out some of your older mature branches. If they get really big and woody in the plant, you may need to go into the plant and do some core pruning to reduce the size. This is a lot like we see in hollies in the landscape. Espalier, I actually have an espalier behind me here, which is a French method of topiary, which is just being pruned on a fence, which is real popular for Camellia as they like to go up against walls. Typically, it's going to be fastened to a fence, a trellis, or some sort of a fastening system. Typically, you're going to prune those once a year to keep them tidy to that fence. And then occasionally on these espalier, branches can die back because they're so dense. If branches die, you just want to prune those all the way back to the main canes so that you can get some fresh new growth the next year. And then lastly, tree-form topiary. This is probably the least common that we see. Some people call them standards. To keep these things kind of tight and tidy on top of their stems, I do have one here behind me. Just again, yearly, trim off the excessive growth to keep that shape you want of that topiary. And then prune off any suckers. This is pretty specific to the tree forms. They will tend to throw up new growth from the base. Prune that off as soon as it comes, very similar to crepe myrtle. Not a bad sign, just get rid of those to get new growth. And I do want to mention, I found a picture of the tea fields in China up on the top right. So you can see some extreme pruning on camellias. They are pretty tough. Now that is Camellia Sinensis, the tea camellia, which is kind of a tougher variety, but they'll literally shear these things down to hedges when they go to harvest the teas. And it makes some really cool landscapes, really, really appealing to the eye. Most homeowners are not going to go for that look, but just to show you exactly how much pruning they can take. All right, now we're going to get into kind of the meat of camellias, really talking about varieties, and you can dig really deep into this, and it seems like the deeper you dig, the more you're going to find. So we're just going to talk about mainly 4 different types of camellia. So Camellia japonica, that's the most common one you see. They're going to bloom typically from November through April. They're the biggest camellias. So in the wild in Japan, you can see them up to 30 feet tall. Typically in our landscape, 10 to 15 feet is about all you're going to get. A dense pyramidal shape, so just kind of upright pyramidal shape. Definitely over 2,000 cultivars within the species alone. As I said, there's been several introduced this year. Most of them are not fragrant. However, if you're researching specific varieties, you can find some that have a slight fragrance. And there's a few here. Jerry Hill japonica, that's going to be kind of a light pink. And then April Dawn, which is the white with the pink stripes, and Spring Promise, which is kind of a reddish pink with a yellow center. Specifically, those April Dawns and Spring Promise, as their name suggests, they're going to be kind of breaking the typical fall bloom, and those are going to push more into the spring, late winter. The next species we're going to talk about is Cesanqua. That's the second most common. Typically, it blooms earlier than the japonicas. It's going to be a little smaller, like 6 to 10 feet in the landscape. Typically, it has a smaller leaf, and most of these are not fragrant either. Probably one of the most popular varieties this time of year in the top right, that's Yuletide. And I do have a Yuletide right behind me to the right. Yuletide is a Cesanqua that, as its name suggests, will bloom typically November, December. Kanjiro, we've had some of those blooming a little earlier this year, so that's going to be like an open pink. And then Marge Miller, we get a lot more of those in topiary forms. It's going to be more of like antique pink color Cesanqua. All right, second page of varieties. Camellia Sinensis, this is something that, as I said, is kind of growing in a little more popularity as people are trying to basically create these edible landscapes. So Camellia Sinensis, that is typically the tea camellia. 6 to 10 feet on the smaller size. It's going to bloom early fall, so September through December typically. I've even seen some of these start to throw blooms on in the summer, so they can be a little intermittent. Generally known to be hardier than the other species, so a little bit tougher. The flowers are fragrant, and they do attract pollinators pretty well, so you'll see a lot of honeybees on these. I think it's probably an underused plant, and it's something we can definitely get into the nursery. So if you're curious about this plant or want to try your hand at producing your own tea, definitely consider Sinensis. And there's the little bloom down there. And lastly, I'm just going to talk about hybrids. There's a ton of hybrids out there. You really want to research each one, whatever its lineage is, to get an idea of what you're getting. Most of them are bred for bloom time, so to change the bloom time of a certain species, to increase cold hardiness, and then to introduce fragrance to the bloom. So they hybridize them for all those. The one that I would pay the most attention to are the Ackerman hybrids, and we do carry quite a few of those. Typically, they're going to be hardy down to -10. They'll bloom pretty early, so October through November. And a lot of them have this winter's prefix. So winter's charm and winter's toughy. And there's other ones like pink icicle is also an Ackerman. Those do really well in this area. They typically research those in North Carolina. So they're trying to push this plant further into the north range to make it more cold hardy. And then I did want to mention Camellia Oleofera. We don't typically carry the straight species, but a lot of hybrids incorporate this tea oil camellia. I do have one right here called Snow Flurry. You can definitely tell in the leaf it's a little bit different, and it looks a little bit tougher for cold. And it's basically hybridized with that Oleofera tea oil camellia to give it a little more toughness. So, and a couple hybrids I kind of have here on the screen. Winter's Charm, and these are all things we have in stock right now. Winter's Charm, which is a nice pink. Arctic Snow, which is going to be kind of a classic white with a yellow center. And the Arctic Rose, which is a nice tight rose type bloom. All right, last rule of thumb. Fertilize camellia spring and fall with an evergreen fertilizer like Hollytone. You can use a number of products. The big thing is no super high nitrogen. We don't want to push these plants to grow excessively, especially close to frost. Okay, I'm going to mention one other plant that we do carry that sometimes gets confused with camellia. Some people call it a camellia tree. It's a little more rare, a little more of a specimen. So that's Stewartia. Stewartia pseudocamellia is the species. These are in the same plant family, the tea plant family, Theaceae, as camellia. Mostly are from Asia. Apparently there are a couple of native varieties. Now, I haven't really seen those at the nursery, but just know they're out there. Some people call them summer dogwood. Native to some parts of Appalachia, and that's going to be Stewartia ovata and Stewartia malacodendron. That's a tongue twister. More cold tolerant than camellias. These are deciduous trees, so they do lose their leaves in fall, but that does mean you're going to get this really nice kind of bronzy golden red fall color. The blooms look real similar to camellia. Typically they're white and about 4 inches, so about that big. And they're going to bloom in the summer. So that's also another benefit, is you'll get blooms when most things are not blooming. Crepe myrtle might be one of the only other things blooming. They'll get the size of a small tree. So if you kind of want more of an upright tree look and you want that camellia bloom, it's a really elegant, kind of open, slow growing tree. As they get older, the bark will get really pretty, rough textured cinnamon brown. Great for a specimen or a collector's plant. We usually only carry a handful of them, but you know, if you're looking for something different, it's a really cool choice. I do have one directly behind me here. They're really showing the fall color right now. And one other plant I just have to mention, just for curiosity's sake. There is a camellia relative that's native to the United States called Franklinia Oleofera. And I think that's named after the Oleofera River where it was discovered. You can find these in gardens and in propagation. We don't really carry them here at the nursery, but the really astounding thing is, as far as we know, they don't exist in the wild anymore. So it's one of those plants that has kind of gone by the wayside in the wild, but you can still find it in collections. So kind of a curiosity. If any of y'all have one that you would like me to dig up, please let me know. I will take it. And just a really cool collector's plant, the Franklinia tree. All right. That's kind of been a big overview. I know we could get really deep into any of these topics. Just kind of wanted to get y'all associated with camellia, kind of get some of the myths out of the way. The next topic is going to be with our own Joy Bovin, called For the Birds, Winter Planting to Attract Birds to Your Garden. This is a really good one. I'm definitely gonna be available for that. Of course, if there's no questions now, we can always, you know, help y'all if you want to come into the nursery. I did list some of the sources that I use because there's a lot of really specific information in here. Like I said, the American Camellia Society is a great resource. There's their website at the bottom. Cam2 is where we get the majority of our camellias. There's their website down at the bottom if you want to kind of look at the varieties they're introducing. And then just kind of a classic reference, the Manual of Woody Landscape Plants by Michael Durr. Just kind of a good overview. I will say that in his book, he says that he cannot do justice to camellias. I mean, there's entire textbooks about camellias. So you can really dig in deep, especially if you're an avid gardener. I can just talk real quick before we close it down about the camellias I have around us. Just kind of pulled a couple that are blooming right now. This one's Winter's Charm. And this is one of those that's bred with the tea camellia. It's got these really nice double blooms on it. I don't know if I can show y'all. You can see it kind of has a little bit of a less glossy leaf, a little more rigid, but I can tell you it's going to be a little more cold hardy. This is kind of a nice starting size if you want a shrub shape. You can see this is very open, loosely branched. You could let this grow for a season and then start trimming it to shape if you want to keep it to size. This is a snow flurry. So this is another Oleofera hybrid. It's got a nice, really frilly white bloom on it. Again, this is a nice size to start with if you want to shape your plant. You know, you could get more of a tree form, or you could get more of a shrub out of this, just depending on how you prune it. There's a standard or a tree topiary back here. I believe this one is Jerry Hill, and we talked about that one. That's going to be a pink. You know, these are a little less common, but if you have a space where you want a specimen sticking up out of your landscape beds, these are really neat. You would just have to prune suckers at the base and then do any pruning to keep it to shape at the top. They will get pretty full. Let's see, there's an espalier back here. I don't know if y'all can see it. Just to show you one that's on a fence. This one's probably in need of a prune after it blooms. You can see it's kind of starting to grow, but it is, in fact, trained on a wooden fence. Here's a better view of it. So you could easily plant this and then train it on a wall afterwards, train it on a bigger trellis, or just keep it to this. Really popular for tight spaces. Let's see, I've got Yuletide. So this one behind me is one of the most popular camellias this time of year. It's just got a really classic dark red, yellow center, very prolific bloomer. It's got a nice smaller leaf, so it will take to trimming and look a little nicer. Just a really good performer, and that's Yuletide. And then lastly, behind me I have a Stewartia. So you can kind of see what this is going to do for fall color. Similar leaf to Camellia, but this is really starting to get this nice coppery tone. Again, this will bloom in summer. Nice little specimen plant. All right. I think I've kind of covered it all, guys. We're going to sign off and we'll see you around. Thanks.